Finland officially became the 31st member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization earlier this week, a move that marks an end of an era of military non-alignment for Finland. The accession ceremony was held on Tuesday, with the Finnish foreign minister handing the accession document to the US Secretary of State, who then declared Finland as a member. The Finnish flag was raised at the Brussels headquarters of the military alliance, joining a circle of 30 other flags. The ceremony coincided with the 74th anniversary of the signing of NATO's founding Washington Treaty on the 4th of April 1949. Finland's president proclaimed it a new era for his country. The head of NATO hailed it as a move that will make Finland safer and the alliance stronger. So how significant is the addition of Finland to NATO, and how does it transform Europe's security landscape? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tina Jha. I'm pleased to welcome distinguished experts on the program to help understand the significance of this historic policy shift by Finland and what it means for the country, for Europe, the United States, and for the rest of the world. I'm pleased to have with us on this edition of the Global Debate, Mr. William E. Pomeranz, Director, Kennan Institute, Wilson Center, Mr. Jacques Rupnik, Director of Research, Sciences Po, he joins us from Paris, and Mr. Jitendra Kumar Tripathi, he's a former ambassador. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the program today. But before we begin with the discussion, I'd like to brief all our viewers about what NATO really is and why Finland has joined the alliance. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 by 12 countries, including the US, the UK, Canada, and France. Now, Finland is the 31st country to have joined the alliance. So since 1949, NATO's membership, as you can see, has increased from 12 to 31 at present. There are at least 4 other countries aspiring to join the world's most powerful military alliance. NATO members agree to help one another if they come under attack. Article 5 of its treaty says that if one member is attacked, every country in the alliance should take it as an act of aggression. The organization's original goal was to challenge Soviet expansion in Europe after the Second World War. But after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, many of the Eastern European countries, which used to be its allies in the Warsaw Pact, were granted NATO membership. Now, Russia, which was formerly part of the Soviet Union, has long argued that NATO's acceptance of Eastern European countries threatens its national security. The question is, why did Finland join NATO? Well, Finland has a 1,340-kilometer land border with Russia. The country adopted neutrality after its defeat by the Soviet in the Second World War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it edged closer to NATO, becoming an official partner of the bloc in 1994. And soon after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership. Now, with Finland having joined the group officially and Sweden waiting to do so, what changes will it bring about? What will be the implications? Let's discuss with the experts who join us on the program today. Mr. Pomeranz, allow me to have the first word from you today on the discussion. How significant is Finland's joining of the NATO? How does it make the country safer and the alliance stronger, something that the NATO head was quoted as saying at the accession ceremony earlier this week?
I think NATO's extension to Finland is a very important sign. I think it is important because Finland decided in the aftermath of Russia's aggression in Ukraine that neutrality was not a viable policy, and that in order to defend Finland, it needed to be a part of NATO. So I think we have seen the end of an era. We used to talk about Finlandization and the fact that Finland wanted to be neutral, and that neutrality had an impact on trade with the Soviet Union and with the Russian Federation. Now that is not going to be the case, and I think this is a very good example of unintended consequences. I think Putin thought that he could divide the EU and NATO. That has not been the case. Instead, he has led to the expansion of NATO.
Mr. Rupnik, 14 months ago, would you have thought that Finland will actually formally join NATO. And now that this has happened, the doubling up of NATO's border with Russia, what does it mean for Moscow?
Well, for Moscow, it means that it thought it had as a main problem Ukraine, which of course is currently where the war is raging, but it certainly didn't have a problem on the border with Finland. As it has just been said, Finland was a neutral country, just as Sweden, and didn't have any intention of joining NATO. I mean, that was a legacy from the post-war situation, where Finland achieved something which many people didn't think possible. That is, you have domestically a relatively great degree of autonomy, but in foreign policy, you keep neutrality and a sort of, let's say, you will not embark on anything that would contradict the Soviet policy in main areas. You would remain neutral as much as you could. Now, the great achievement, so to speak, of Putin's war in Ukraine has been to cancel these 70 years of neutrality and bring the Finns to conclude, just as the Swedes, who have been a neutral country for a couple of centuries. So you bring neutral countries, you force them to think that the only way to achieve security vis-à-vis Russia is to join NATO. So, yeah, unintended consequences. I would think this is a polite way of saying a disastrous result from Russia's point of view. It also means now that the Baltic Sea, we don't have a map, but the Baltic Sea, which basically covers the whole area, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and all the way to Russia, that the Baltic Sea will be predominantly now a NATO sea. I mean, mainly controlled by NATO countries. That too cannot be a great strategic achievement from the Russian point of view.
Right. So what implications will it have, Ambassador Tripathi, when it comes to more conflict as the war rages in Ukraine? Does that put the NATO and Russia in a more like a situation where there is possibility of a direct confrontation now? All this while in Ukraine, the NATO has refrained from engaging directly. But does this mean that now Europe and the world should brace for a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia?
Well, certainly it means escalation of tension in the area, because now Russia's border with NATO has almost doubled. As regards possibility of direct conflict, I very much doubt that Putin will be so clueless or so, witless to open another confrontation, another front with Finland. Remember, even beginning of the war with Ukraine, with so-called aggression of Russia, it had already been said by Putin time and again that we do not want any action against Sweden or against Finland. Our action is only against Ukraine. And I think many people, many experts, they claim that, okay, Russia has invaded Ukraine and the situation has already changed. But they do not want to, or they forget to go back to 1991, when the bipolar world was transferred to one unipolar world with the disintegration of Soviet Union. And NATO Secretary General as well as US Foreign Secretary, State Secretary of State have time and again assured Russian leadership that NATO will not be allowed to move even an inch towards east. But those were the hollow words, hollow promises. And NATO had been increasing. I don't know what was the utility of NATO in 1991 when the Warsaw Pact was disintegrated, when the Soviet Union was disintegrated. So there was no need for NATO to be anymore. At least not till 2000. One can say that, okay, Putin has these are Putin's policies, and because of Putin's expansionist policies, this happened, that happened. But Putin came only in this century. Not no, but before that, for the 9 years or 10 years, there was no Putin in power. But even then, NATO kept on expanding. So that was the basic fallacy. That was the basic imperialist mentality of NATO, I would say. I'm not a supporter of Putin. Yes, Putin did a bad job in attacking on Ukraine. Perhaps Putin could have waited for some more time, but he didn't. But that doesn't absolve NATO from the mistakes that it has made. I mean, more than half of the world is still at loss of wits to find out what was utility of NATO after 1991. There were two power blocks. One power block was disintegrated. So what was the use of another power block?
Okay.
But people
That's
who
a fair
support
point.
NATO,
Let me
they
get
do
in
not.
Mr. Pomeranz' reactions to that. Mr. Pomeranz, the fact that Moscow has not taken it kindly, of course, they have responded by saying that this development, this move is going to face countermeasures from Russia. How serious are these threats from Russia in the times to come? And as we just discussed, the war wages in Ukraine, there is no end in sight. Do we see a possibility of more conflict, more tensions in Europe?
I do not see that Russia will engage NATO just because Finland and potentially Sweden have joined the pact. And I would say that the question of whether NATO should or should not have expanded is an open question. I would say that there is a great deal of dispute amongst historians as to what was promised and what was not promised after the end of the Cold War. That being said, NATO allows sovereign nations to decide their security, and that was why these countries decided to join NATO. I should also add that if indeed Poland and the Baltic states and other countries were not a member of NATO, I would assume that Putin would have tried to attack them early in this conflict as well. So I think that we can dispute whether NATO should or should not have expanded. But in terms of this war, I think Putin has made sure that he does not implicate or attack a NATO country because he does not want this war to escalate. The question going forward is whether Ukraine will ultimately become a member of NATO and the European Union. It has, again, been given candidate membership because in the aftermath of this war, and clearly Ukraine wants to be in Europe, and that has been a goal for basically since independence. So I think that there is room for questioning whether NATO should have expanded, but in light of Putin's aggression and in light of his willingness not to allow or to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, I think that the increased membership of NATO has basically made sure that Russia does not expand this war into a more European war.
Okay, but Mr. Rupnik, do you also see it having security implications for Europe? A number of analysts have criticized the move. They say that it's brought Europe at Russia's door, and the conflict could potentially worsen in the times to come with disastrous consequences for Europe. So even during the Ukraine war, we've seen how Europe has had to face the brunt. Do you see that happening in the times to come?
I do not see new risks associated with Finland joining NATO. That for Europeans, this is not seen as enhancing the risks. It might enhance the security of Finland. This is why actually they applied. Nobody forced Finland to apply.
Yes.
This was not a conquest of Finland or something like that. It was a Finnish application. And why did the Finns apply? Well, because they were watching what was happening in Ukraine and they felt vulnerable. So, so that I don't think is the main worry. The main worry is the war in Ukraine and possible escalations there, because that is something that cannot be ruled out. And we have now had more than a year's war. It's a war now looking like a stalemate. Some people predict a very long frozen situation. Others expect a lot from the spring offensive that is heralded by the Ukrainians. Well, we'll see. I'm not strictly speaking a military expert, but I would say that, yes, there is a fear of escalation and being drawn into a conflict. On the European side, the main concern is twofold. Not allow Ukraine to be defeated, because that would have disastrous security consequences. On the other hand, not to be drawn into the conflict as a warring party. So you provide support to Ukraine, but you do not get engaged. This is sort of a balancing act of the Ukrainians and of the Europeans. At the same time, one should clearly distinguish NATO and EU. EU, the European Union, has granted Ukraine candidate status, which in times of war seems extremely difficult to imagine what concretely that could mean. Right. It was mainly a strong political and symbolic gesture. It could also suggest that in the long run, after the war, Ukraine has now the prospect of joining the European Union, and that's a big question mark for the EU. It will transform the European Union. You know, the center of gravity of the EU will be shifting further to the east of Europe. This is a large country. It's larger than France. It has more than 40 million inhabitants, which from an Indian perspective is not a lot, but in the European context it is. And so, yes, there will be a huge agenda for the EU. And the question about NATO, I think everybody is being very cautious. You cannot talk about a country that is at war right now joining an alliance. That's the NATO alliance is to protect the members against an aggression.
But what about Sweden, Mr. Pomerantz? Sweden's membership bid has been put on hold by Turkey, also Hungary. Turkey, we understand there was opposition in the earlier days, but why is Hungary opposed to Sweden's NATO membership? If you could help us and our viewers understand.
I think that Hungary is against Sweden's membership because the president of Hungary has been closely allied, not really allied, but has not really renounced the war in Ukraine. He has continued to have oil and gas exports come to Hungary. And so he is, at best, not a firm supporter of the expansion of NATO at Russia's expense. So I think Mr. Orban has been very diplomatic in terms of how he views this war, but he has not wanted to go against Russia, who is still a major energy supplier for Hungary.
Okay, Ambassador Tripathi, since we're talking about NATO's expansion and the kind of implications it could have, just a few days ago, we heard about how NATO is now turning its focus towards the Indo-Pacific. There are several countries in the Indo-Pacific which actually also believe that a free and open Indo-Pacific cannot become a reality without having NATO a part of it. What would be India's response to it? India is a key player for us. Indo-Pacific is central to our foreign policy. NATO's involvement in the Indo-Pacific region to contain China, what does this mean for India?
You see, we are 100%, officially India is 100% in for a peaceful, for a free Indo-Pacific region, a free and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. And For that, we have joined Quad also, and for that we have supported Indonesian viewpoint, we have supported Dutch viewpoint, German viewpoint, and French viewpoint. So many countries in NATO are in line with us when it comes to Indo-Pacific and containment of China and that. But we do not think that it needs to be on organizational basis. I mean to say, we do not think that NATO as an organization should focus on Indo-Pacific, and then we should act according to that, because that will give that NATO's attitude towards Indo-Pacific will give a partisan attitude, partisan attitude or partisan behavior towards Indo-Pacific, which we do not support. But yes, India, as a pillar of its foreign policy, India fully supports that the Indo-Pacific should be free, inclusive, and it should be peaceful. So that is what we have been supporting.
Okay, Mr. Pomerantz, your thoughts on NATO being part of the Indo-Pacific. We've been hearing a lot of meetings happen with the NATO chief, also with Indo-Pacific leaders over the last couple of days. There was no official word on it, but of course, reports suggesting NATO's newfound interest in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad so far has refrained to declare itself a military alliance. Is there need for a military alliance like the NATO to step in to contain a belligerent China in the region? Mr. Pomerantz?
Well, again, I will defer to my Indian colleague as to whether a NATO-type organization is needed in the Indo-Pacific. I just would suggest that with the war in Ukraine and with NATO and the Europeans supplying a significant amount of ammunition and military know-how to Ukraine, that I would think that expanding NATO around the world would be an overstretch that I'm not sure NATO can really handle.
Okay, Mr. Rupnik, if the war continues and if there is fresh conflict, if Russia actually, I mean, if it's not just hollow threats, and if Russia actually builds up security on, the border with Finland, it's a long border, we understand, about 1,300 kilometers. How will NATO secure Finland's border?
Well, I suppose NATO can supply the Finnish army with the equipment it needs. Finnish army is one of the most, one of the best organized armies in the EU. They were a neutral country, but it was armed neutrality. They had historical experience with Russia, especially during World War II, and they kept a very strong military posture. And so it's a long border, as you said. I don't see, and they don't think there is an immediate military threat because Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. I mean, they have difficulty handling the Ukrainian case. They are now trying to do a new mobilization, and, they brought in 300,000, now 400,000 more are expected to be mobilized. This is all for Ukraine. So this is no situation where Finland would be jeopardized, I don't think. What you will have is in the Finnish accession to NATO, it means no American soldiers on Finnish ground, no American nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. So its membership, it's provide protection in case you were attacked, but it is not meant as a base that could be threatening Russia or something like that. This is, I think, what the Finns are trying to convey to the Russians.
Okay, Ambassador, I'll take one last question from you. Mr. Rupnik spoke about nuclear weapons. The question here is also about, it's Finland today joining the NATO. It'll be Sweden in a few months from now. Who knows, in a few days. There are other aspiring countries also, in NATO membership bid. If Russia continues to be urged like this, and an unpredictable Moscow at the moment, already engaged in war with Ukraine, could it also, lead to the possibility of nuclear escalation, something that has happened over the course of the last 1 year? Ambassador?
Me?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
You see, with all said and done, I don't think there is absolutely any possibility of nuclear escalation or nuclear war having started in the area. Because you see, before this, there had been many flashpoints. There had been war in Syria, there had been in Baghdad, there had been in Kuwait, there had
Right.
been in Libya, there had been in Korea, there had been tension in Cuba, but there had been war in Vietnam, but both parties of the war were sensible enough to realize that if the nuclear option is utilized, that then there would be no humankind left because irrespective of whatever 6,800 or 5,600 nuclear warheads you have, but for a nuclear warfare to start and to finish, only a few, three, four are required, and after that, there won't be any war at all. So I don't think either of the sides, Putin or NATO, are insensible enough to start this nuclear war. During the last 1 year, we have been
You're right. You're right. Let's
hearing
hope it remains
rumors.
a flashpoint this time also, and it doesn't escalate to a level of nuclear escalation, because that is going to be devastating for the entire region and for the world at large. The world has already been, bearing consequences of the prolonged war in Russia and Ukraine for more than a year, with significant implications for at least countries who are the most vulnerable, the most poor people in the world. Let's hope the war comes to a halt, and we hope that it doesn't escalate. Even if there are tensions rising in the region, it doesn't escalate to the level of nuclear threats. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time next week now. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sunset TV.